All yours, Ellie.
Great, thanks. Excellent. So thanks everyone. I think we can start the round. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the first affirmative speaker to begin.
Hello, can I be heard? Okay. Shout out to the environment. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. The animal agriculture industry is one of the largest contributors to global CO2 emissions, global methane emissions, and in general climate change. Currently, the environmentalist movement already has a pre-existing stance on agriculture. Specifically, animal agriculture should be dropped wholesale or scaled back massively in most countries. Their utopia is a world where ideally most of these farms have been dropped. What do we specifically include in our messaging? Because there is a gap in this messaging, one that has left workers behind and one that has made them feel unheard and most importantly, just terrible. So first of all, we specifically target positive motivation, that we will provide new jobs. So there's one, a change in advocacy, and two, a change in the people that we're trying to target with that advocacy. So we talk about jobs in meat processing plants being replaced with jobs in plant harvesting plants, for example, or putting people in farming, lab-grown, cultivated meat. But also the narrative change about how we market ourselves and also the specific industries we actually invest in. So that's what changes. The second component to the strategy is the negative comparisons. So we talk about how currently animal jobs are not only bad for the environment, they're also bad for people. Where if you work at a meat packing plant, for example, you're more exposed to avian flu, bovine flu, you're 10 times more likely to get a divorce because of the sheer mental toll it takes to slaughter cows over and over again. Or, even the antibiotic resistant diseases that you're more likely to get infected by because you're staying so close to these things. In general, the point of our argument on Government Bench is to show that, one, this is the most important and effective way to push for a very important advocacy. Number two is that this is a compelling argument to convince previously unwilling stakeholders. And number three is that this just makes the movement itself better on a holistic fashion. Briefly, as a prerequisite to this, I'm first going to talk about why this is likely to be done well and why there will be enough jobs for these workers to be transplanted into. Number one is that, by construction, there are just more jobs because plants are more efficient per square mile, which means you can hire more workers per square mile due to things like trophic levels and how much nutrients they need to grow up. Number two is because many of these skills are transferable. So if you're attempting to nourish the land, it's a change of what you're trying to nourish it with, rather than, instead of for animals, it's for plants. And number three is that the investment impetus is itself large. So of course, many of these jobs are future resilient. For example, they're more likely to be resistant to natural disasters. And of course, there's a change in funding as well that spurs this on in the first place. Argument one. We are more convincing, and we're also more likely to get massive scale benefits that op will never get. So the first thing we're going to point out is that we're more convincing to three key stakeholder groups. First, we're more convincing to politicians who feel like the economic plan that the environmentalist movement suggests is substantially more secure, and hence they feel like they're more confident in legislating disruptive environmental policies because, one, there's a safety net for many disaffected voters that could potentially vote against them. But secondly is that this is a more sensible plan and fits within a broader comprehensive economic framework because it includes, things that can actually spur on the economy. People still have money to, for example, consume and buy other things because, again, they're still employed. Secondly is that we're also more convincing to companies. Not only is there now a larger willing labor base for you to invest in green agriculture instead of just, normal conventional animal agriculture, there's also tech-intensive industries which are hard to understand, but now it's much easier to understand them because we can focus on them from a labor perspective. So instead of seeing it as some sort of abstract lab-cultivated meat or some sort of abstract like you're eating bugs and stuff, like you can actually see what it's like from the perspective of the labor, so it's much more convincing to companies and people on the ground. But number three is that in terms of voters, you take away and dispel the myth that the environmentalist movement is totally naive, they don't understand how economics work, and beyond that it's harder to convince voters against the environmentalist movement by saying, oh, it's going to harm some kid in the third world that relies on like farming cows because this is the only way that they could provide for themselves. Hence, we're more convincing to the most important key stakeholders that act as impediments to changing these things, whether it be through directly legislating changes in, for example, farming policy, agricultural policy, or whether it be through voters on the ground themselves choosing what they want to buy, or even the companies themselves deciding what companies to start up. This leads to benefits in three key areas. The first is that we make the transition to a much greater degree than what we would prospectively have in opposition because we increase the willingness for them to have larger margins in terms of taxes on carbon, for example, or taxes on animal meat. So this has three key benefits. The first is that in terms of global climate emissions like methane and CO2 emissions, we just have less of them because we're much more willing to have a radical policy in terms of the margins of change, which simply means that we're much less likely to have things like lung disease in people around the world. We're much more likely to slow down the pace of climate change, which means we have less droughts. This small change presently compounds into massive changes that affect hundreds of thousands of people in the future because it's a prospectively very large change in many countries. Secondly is that in terms of animal suffering and in terms of deforestation, we're much less likely to cause massive amounts of untold harm to animals because we're scaling back this massively, compared to opposition, which would fail to convince people in the first place and hence would not ever get this change. But number three is that the job itself that we produce in government are just prospectively better. We feed more people because plants tend to be more efficient in terms of producing food. They tend to be cheaper per unit of food we provide for individuals, which means we're much more likely to provide food security for people, particularly in the developing world that are wreaked by natural disasters. That's the first thing. The second thing is we also get these benefits more quickly. OP gets bogged down in a variety of political debates that are not only one, impossible to get through because they rely on people's values that they've imbibed on for very long periods of time. Like, for example, that this is my job, this is how I want to work, this is how I want to live, etc. And so taking that away from them without providing an alternative would make it impossible to get past them. But these political debates also look very, very bad for the rest of the environmental movement because you just look heartless in terms of trying to take away their job without giving them an alternative. Beyond the cultural focus, it's also just the fact that if you lose jobs, the state cannot provide on welfare. So even if they successfully convince people, if the state doesn't have the money to provide for these people, it would simply not be able to act that policy in a sensible fashion because it inevitably have to revert it. Which means that oftentimes it's a very, very difficult very, very difficult pathway to actually getting this policy instituted in the first place. Which means one, OP has to spend much, much longer, and in many cases they never institute this policy. But two, in the case where they do institute it after 10 to 15 years, that's 10 to 15 years of CO2 having been emitted to the air, making climate change a much harder problem to solve in the first place. Which means if both sides succeed, our side is much better at succeeding in the long term because we have less of a problem to solve in the first place because OP spends more time creating that problem and tending to solve it. The third and final thing is that we solve our problem more sustainably. So the first thing is that OP builds a critical mass of people wronged by the environmental movement that will eventually grow large enough to either vote against it, whether in individual states where they're quite large, or even be heard as a vocal minority on the national stage to convince the hearts of people against the environmental movement. Which means there's a very large chance that even if OP does succeed in convincing people about their policy, in a few years people become dissatisfied and repeal that policy, which means they don't get any meaningful change because for the long term they don't have that policy in place. But secondly is that since there's more people unemployed, as you said earlier, there's less money from the state because they're spending on the welfare that you need to give these people to keep these people alive, which means there's less money on investing in green technology, there's less money in subsidy, which means the net amount of money invested in green technology and green agriculture is actually less on opposition. But third and finally is that, again, these states, when they lose eventually lots of money because lots of people are unemployed, these states are forced to turn to cheaper, more environmentally damaging alternatives, which means maybe potentially or prospectively they could succeed, but since people are unemployed, states are forced to damage the environment even more to make money for themselves and for people. Which means on a massive, different scale of things, one is that we get a much larger benefit in terms of saving the world. Number two is that we save the world more quickly, which is a very important thing, especially as the environment and climate change compounds into the future. And number three is that we actually have the solutions there. The second argument is that there's also an incentive problem in the environmental movement, which is it is plagued by systemic inequality and systemic elitism because of the fact that it refuses to contact and discuss with laborers as a product of its explicit strategy to focus primarily on dropping the agriculture industry. We fix this in three key ways. The first is that by construction, and you want to do this as the environmental movement because it's the most convincing way to talk to people, is you're probably forced to contract laborers and have discussions with them in order to better inform what kind of policies and what kind of industry areas you would like to target in the first place, which means you have more input from well-educated and well-informed workers, those that know what's like on the ground. Number two is that workers itself feel the movement is more welcoming, so they self-select into the movement much more, which means you have a broader diversity of opinions from those that are systemically underrepresented in the environmentalist movement. And number three is that there's a more larger diversity of discourse, since workers that even aren't part of the movement can feel welcome to join because they aren't kicked out immediately on the excuse or on the pretense of, well, you're just standing in the way of progress, so there's no point in listening to you. Now they're explicitly part of the movement, which means the incentives itself get better. Sometimes the environmental does good ideas, which is what we're defending here, but sometimes they do bad ideas like, metal straws, for example, or eco-terrorism. And they're much less likely to purport for these bad ideas, which are not only one, harmful to the movement itself, two, harmful for people, but also three, impair the credibility of the movement. We would now never have these ideas in the first place because we have a broader diversity of ideas and opinions to choose from in the first place, which means the movement itself gets better. And so that's why we propose.
Yeah, I thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the first negative speaker to introduce the negative team's case.
Sorry, everyone, just give me a moment to get my notes in order. Sorry, 1 second. All right. Okay, start in 3, 2, 1. When making a decision about its messaging, a movement should focus on the issues that it is most credible and on the issues where it will be able to make the best arguments, the most in accordance with the desires of that movement's membership. The first thing I'll do in this speech is just provide some brief setup, and then I'll make 2 arguments. The first argument will be about how this fractures the movement internally and why that's a debate-losing harm for this affirmative team. And the second argument will be about why all of their benefits around this messaging would have on people outside of the movement would not be successful. Firstly, onto the question of setup. Obviously, the messaging here refers to communications that apply both internally and externally. So we're including things like the public statements of leaders or the newsletters that are circulated within the movement, and also the public statements and the ad campaigns that the movement employs more generally. And just to sort of the comparison between the 2 teams is clear here. What we would say is we would, on side of the affirmative, obviously they have to kind of expand the just transition rhetoric to include like agribusiness and so on, whereas we would instead focus on the public arguments that this movement is already good at, like arguing for a global carbon tax, arguing for better regulation, arguing for government investment in renewables, and hyping up the harms of climate change in an attempt to create a moral consensus around this particular issue. So let's move on to the first argument, which is about how this damages the movement internally in a way the side affirmative can never really recover from. The first piece of context I want to start here is just asking who the environmental movement is. We would point to there a set of organizations who come together, individuals who come together from a network of people who care extremely about the environment. And the historical base of this movement is in conservationism. They care about national parks, they care about natural beauty, they care about being close to and closely entwined and connected with nature. And it's important to weigh this material in terms of how this set of people are affected by the messaging choices. Because one, the strength of the movement, obviously the strength of the movement actually being efficacious in this messaging, but the strength of the movement to do literally anything is obviously contingent on having a sense of togetherness, of a shared set of values. People are pushing and pulling together because protest movements are built around a lot of collective sacrifice and people taking risks for each other out of a sense of solidarity. But the second reason this internal movement stuff is so important is because the movement is by far the one who is impacted by the messaging the most. They read it the most. They read the newsletter. They spend time. They care about this. They do this in their spare time for fun is because they care about it extremely. And changes in messaging obviously affect them because they're the people who see the messaging the most. So why is this set of people likely to be harmed by this change? The first thing to understand here is the average environmentalist often, while maybe they do care to some extent, or sometimes they care about agribusiness insofar as it affects the environment, but animal rights justice is often just importantly not their key concern. And the workers' rights of people who work in these industries is often definitely not their concern. And to the extent that they care about it all, they have a stack of other priorities they care about more, like local conservation efforts in their area, the global effect things will have on the environment, globally getting a carbon tax through, and so on. And importantly here, when they see this messaging, they see it as coming at the opportunity cost of all of the things that they actually are passionate about and want the movement to talk about, because the movement has a set of limited constraints. Why is that so in terms of its ability to message? Why is that so? One, it's obviously literally resource constrained and cash constrained because it is not aligned with business interests at all. They have to directly stand up against that. They often do not win over high-income voters here. But two, obviously the environmental movement lacks airtime, which is to say there's only a certain amount of airtime that they're able to give, and there's only a certain amount that ordinary people are willing to listen to them, which means that the opportunity cost that when these members look at the movement making a big messaging decision, they see instead of that messaging decision, all the possible other messages they could have run with, all the possible other issues they could have prioritized. But the third observation here is that many of them are just fine, or the second observation here is many of them are just fine with eating meat and become irritated when they feel guilty on the movement they care about so much tries to make them feel guilty with that. And the third thing is obviously just like there are many people within the animal rights and the third thing to point out here is there are members of or allies of the environmentalist movement, like the animal rights movement, who likely be appalled by these arguments because they see these farmers and producers as murderers of animals. And this obviously harm is amplified when Side Affirmative explicitly talk about incorporating those guys into the movement. I'll explain later why workers and members of the industry don't trust the environmental movement anyway, but it amplifies these harms, right? Because the animal rights allies see you as trying to incorporate these murderers into the movement. The effect this has on the internal social dynamics of the movements are as follows. A set of social incentives are created to become internally critical of the movement, to argue more. Toxic fights begin. Previously toxic fights that might have been suppressed emerge again as people form upon factual lives and get really mad. That obviously has the net effect of pushing people away from the movement. They just want to spend less time and give less because it's been very bad. But obviously it also undermines and you probably lose the animal rights. Like, so them then will move away. They'll lose and be lost entirely. They'll no longer want to associate with you. That obviously means you get less support of protests, less support of all the kinds of important collective action these movements require. You also get less donations, which means their ability to be effective in all messaging over time gets down because ad buys are expensive. And of course, you don't get the ability to incorporate further people because the movement is incredibly toxic and people don't want to join. The impact of this argument is obviously debate winning for the very simple reason that the movement is one of the most important movements in the world. We want it to continue to thrive and be successful. Side Affirmative want that too. The movement in 20 years, we're much smaller under their side than ours. Finally, secondly then, onto external messaging. The observation we make here is obviously, as I've already pointed out, there's an opportunity cost. The burden on AFA to prove why this messaging is particularly efficacious. Here is why it is not. The first thing to understand here is that the context of transitioning away from meat is obviously more about consumers than it is about anyone in the industry, for the very simple reason that consumer demand is the reason that people eat so much meat, not that Steggles has brainwashed us all of us into eating chicken. There are four structural reasons as to why it's the case consumers like this. One, it tastes extremely good. People like eating meat. Two, meat is often highly prestigious and a sign of a high income in many countries. Three, there are an enormous set of cultural associations with consuming that people like. Four, the environmental movement has no credibility when campaigning to consumers here. And then five, we'd also just point out that you point out that there's a massive shift in consumer behavior demand here because we're talking about all animal products, right? That includes skincare products, includes things in medicine, it includes gelatin. That stuff is in everything. You're asking people to make a tremendous change in their behavior, which one, they don't want to do. And two, the analysis you're using to this is some economic argument about someone else getting a job that they don't even care about. It's unlikely to appeal their direct interest. They're unlikely to care. And that means you don't get the industry moving in any way because the industry just follows where the consumers go. And we point to their own analysis about workers are so poorly paid to identify that one, workers are not a key group because they're a minority. And two, if consumers cared about the fates of workers, they wouldn't be in such terrible conditions right now. Finally, then you just don't compensate anyone in the industry, obviously because they often tend to be rural capitalists and farmers for whom being a meat producer is an important part of their identity. Two, when they hear the words just transition, they focus on the transition part and know that they're out to get them. And that applies especially to workers who are especially afraid of losing one of the few jobs they have. They're often quite poor here. We would finally point out that even if people listened, what you're asking legislators to do is make more promises to the electorate, which they're often reticent to do, which is why politicians often don't want to make just transition promises because it forces them to commit to spending in the future they don't want to. The final point here is it's a point of mitigation, which is to say there are a range of technological problems that are already going to solve this. Lab-grown meat is incredibly expensive, incredibly growing incredibly fast. So is plant-generated or plant-based products. And importantly, there's a tremendous amount of private capital and government support for this for the reasons they identify, but also because lab-grown meat is incredibly scalable, right? There is no input cost associated with managing a cow over the course of its lifetime. If you can get that factory process, you'll print money. The end of all this point is the transition. This is not the place the environmental movement should be conducting its messaging. One, because it harmed the movement internally, but two, it's just not the most important thing the movement should be doing, and it's not the place they can convince people. And even if they could convince people, tech and capital are already moving the relevant actors in this direction. The key thing here to understand is consumers are not persuaded by this. They are the key swing variable in any debate about meat. And importantly, right, you do not motivate them by trying to tell them about how workers are better off. You motivate them by telling them about environmental harms and how bad that is, and focusing primarily on that and using a limited public persuasion resources on that. For those reasons, incredibly proud to oppose.
Thanks very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the second affirmative speaker to continue the affirmative team's case.
Hello, can I be heard? All right, starting my speech. Oh, wait, hold on. I'll set up a timer. In 3, 2, 1. Their characterization of the environmentalist movement is that they say they're a elitist bunch of cosmopolitans who think that everyone who works in the meat industry is a murderer, and it's a good thing that old MacDonald gets unemployed and goes on welfare because of the transition that they propose. Not only is this like a little bit ridiculous, given that a movement that is by its nature humanitarian and caring about the existence of humanity would likely care about the effects of the policy of that they implement. But their secondary program, which is to just say, oh, we will quote unquote focus on issues that we are already winning at, kind of doesn't work, given that the premise of the environmental movement is to stop things like climate change, which necessitates that you stop things like the most polluting industry in the world. So I think it's kind of clear that opposition's case is both nonsensical and not a good strategy to actually make sure that we achieve the goals that we want to achieve. So I'm gonna like format my speech into 3 main points. The first of all, I'm gonna talk about why not talking about things like the meat industry is a losing issue, both in terms of what we aim to achieve and in terms of what we're already doing. Second of all, I'll talk about how if we need to do things like remove the consumption of meat and animal products, this is the most effective way to do it, contrary to what they're saying on GOP. And thirdly, I'll talk about how, even if they're entirely correct that right now the movement is a little bit elitist and therefore it's not in the interest of their compositional members, how the change of the internal people within that movement is going to be a good thing to make the movement more inclusive. First of all, let's just talk about their secondary case, which is to suggest we should just focus on other issues that we are winning at. What issue are we currently winning? They kind of have a lot of critiques to how, people like to eat meat. It's a cultural thing. They don't want to give up their makeup supplies. What's their alternative? That you're going to ask people to stop driving cars, going on airplanes, etc. They have a lot of complaints on op, but they never actually make a serious comparison to why meat is actually something that people are significantly less willing to give up, especially since it is presumably a cultural subjective choice and also changes per the habits, i.e. if there are cultural changes on what things that people consider desirable, what are the taste tolerances of people which naturally change over time, I would imagine that yes, generally people are adverse to not eating meat, but presumably these are a lot more tangible than whether or not you can get your job on a plane, etc. So there's the first question of how, well, I don't think that they provide the strategy on how this is less powerful, but the second one is that I don't think that this is actually a strategy that we can drop. So, and if we talk about what are the tipping points for the environmental movement, one of the common ones is that we don't want to go above 1.5 degrees centigrade in terms of global warming, or 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees because of a series of tipping points such as the Arctic permafrost melting, the glaciers melting, which means that you reflect less heat from the sun, etc., which means that over time it becomes harder and harder to reduce climate change. The proof that just destroys op is that without reforms to agriculture, we will already exceed 2 degrees. So even if you take their case at their best, where we step literally every single ounce of carbon that is already being emitted in status quo, you wouldn't have enough to save the environment and stop things like an environmental catastrophe. The third thing is if you just don't believe science and you just suggest I guess we could focus on other things, can you actually propose that on op? Because the status quo is that the environmental movement is already against the consumption of meat, right? So presumably it is on op where you say, actually, guys, we don't want to talk about this anymore. There's going to be shift in the environmental movement. And it's kind of strange that they prop it, because them on op, they give so many reasons why these people think that people who eat animal are murderers. They have already pre-existing grievances against people who eat meat in the meat industry. All of these suggesting that not only do they give very compelling reasons to why we can't shift, they also give on GOV reasons why it would be impossible for us to achieve our goals if we do shift, but thirdly, there are a series of status quo reasons to why not shifting is not an option. So this is to suggest that in order for opposition to win this debate, they do have to talk about whether or not we're going to descale things like animal agriculture. So then this comes into a question of how. And I think their responses to this are kind of a pittance, because they kind of just suggest that, well, the real issue here is that internally within the movement, it's going to be a little bit harder because there are going to be some disagreements, and therefore it's not going to be us capable of maximizing the airtime, etc. So we already kind of debunked that by suggesting that disagreements will happen anyway, especially since the movement's already favoring deconstructing a lot of these issues. I think the only piece of salient material here is that they're so objectively against the people who are working here that they would go out of their way to kind of harm the people so that they don't get jobs. I think this is a little bit nonsensical. People in the developing world also eat meat. Presumably there's a large degree of empathy. Even if you don't have empathy over the meat industry, you have an empathy of working for a paycheck and working for employment, especially if there are cultural connections, you live in the same country, etc. But the second thing is that even if it's true that there's some internal disagreement, they don't even prove that that's the tipping point of their mechanism. Like, if you only talk about it in a moral sense, which is their prop on op, your opponents, Republicans, conservatives, will just go up to you in any debate and advertisement and just be like, what happens to all of the people that you unemploy? Like, their assumption is that on op, they're so strong that they're kind of capable of muddying and holding the debate hostage and not talking about any of the issues against them, to the extent that opposition members would demand a response from the environmental movement. They're particularly insolvent. But I think the third thing here is like, it's about where you can get those degrees of change, because they kind of talk about people in the abstract now. Abstract voters, whether you can change their mind with a moral argument about saving the world. But like, who are the people in positions of power to actually create those tangible degrees of change? So I think we convinced two people more specifically, right? There's one within the local government units that actually control and regulate the process and the creation of meat, i.e. agricultural states, agricultural counties, etc., in which you need a broad popular support domestically from the people who work there to regulate, to tax things like the meat industry, to get some degree of substantial change. But secondly is also the capital, to the extent on their side where they suggest that oftentimes it's a supply issue. That is to mean that both companies create domestic supply, which lowers price, which increases demand, but also creates the advertisement which generates demand because people want to eat meat because meat is desirable. To the extent that we make meat less profitable, we provide a way for capital and labor to shift to other industries. Both the supply and demand of meat likely goes down in the world of government when you actually give people alternatives from a process that even they consider to be bad because they suffer from climate change. That is to suggest, on the world of opposition, you really give these people no choice. They're forced to perpetuate both the consumption and the production of meat because there isn't a means by which they can change, and the environmental movement actively tries to exclude them by the very basis of the exclusionary rhetoric that they have in opposition. It is only in a world where these incentives are clear, where you tell investors where to go, and you provide politicians an avenue to fix a problem that is electorally hard for them, but clearly objectively good for them, to actually make sure that you care about the meat industry. But third of all, let's talk about this comparative, because this motion isn't necessarily as the environmentalist movement, but it's specifically talking about whether the interests of the environmentalist movement are good. That is to suggest, if we include a lot of these people in our rhetoric, farmers, laborers, people who are typically disaffected by the effects of globalization, etc., not only is that good from an objective perspective in which we have more voices and we're seen as less elitist, but it also just makes the movement accessible. Like, who are you to say that the environmental movement should care solely about the issues of like total climate change, but not about the adverse issues that they create when they create things like unemployment? If these are things that genuinely affect people on the ground, that genuinely affect people's lived experiences, that take a burden on the state in terms of welfare as well as their own lived experiences, these experiences are not only equally as valid, but presumably are significantly a morally important thing for you to do, because you are the creator of the harms, which therefore you have a moral responsibility to both include those people in your movement and make sure that they have some degree to control the decisions. That is to suggest, even if we get nothing, the inclusion of these people in our movement, putting them in our own platforms, and the creation of things like labor movements within the environmental movement is a net good move for the movement itself and a net good for society. With that, we're proud to propose.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the second negative speaker to continue the negative team's case.
Hello.
I'm assuming I'm audible. Okay. To include the messaging of just transition around the end of the animal agriculture industry within the environmentalist movement's messaging is the death sentence of the environmentalist movement, is going to cripple it, is going to freeze it, is going to make all of the things that it is asking for, the most high maintenance and expensive policies that anybody could possibly propose that were already extremely at odds with the demands from the public, with people who never wanted the animal industry of agriculture to die, that always wanted it to be a part of their lives. It was a stupid thing to prioritize and would badly damage the movement. The first question of this speech will deal with what is the most convincing messaging that this movement can adopt in order to convince key groups in order to achieve its goals. The first key point to point out here is that that team has only acted like the environmentalist movement exists to end the animal agriculture industry. Like it exists to end bee farmers and beef farmers, but it doesn't care about anything else. That wasn't true. It has a lot of priorities. It has limited resources. It is trying to do exactly what they tell you, which is avoid us from getting to the tipping point where climate change cannot be reversed. It is trying to do that through the set of policies that it can maximize the utility from arguing, that are easy to get to, like glide like butter into the public perception, right? So this team is telling you that it would be more convincing to take on the message that, hey, wouldn't it be great if we totally disrupted the animal industry of agriculture and we provided hundreds of billions of dollars worth of job guarantees to every single person who might get unemployed because of it. And they think that this will be more convincing to three groups. The first group they said was like, well, if we provide a just transition narrative, we'll make politicians feel more safe about disrupting the animal agriculture industry. The best version of this argument, the most generous way that I can take it, is I think they mean that right now the animal product industry won't change unless there's any legislative support from government, because the voters will lose too many jobs, right? I think that's the best possible version of this argument. The first thing to say about why that's wrong is that it is literally wrong in that governments already are very comfortable screwing over farmers and animal producers all the time, right? They do things like push down the prices of milk and their ability to profit from the things that they produce. If the government thought this was a key voter and really needed to pander to them, then milk would cost $5 per litre because everybody makes a loss in it right now, right? That doesn't make any sense. But secondly, this isn't the action needed to bring down the animal agriculture industry in the first place. The problem that we have isn't a lack of legislative pressure and support. We aren't worried about, because the reason that you need the just transition narrative for something like energy is because energy is structured very differently to the animal agriculture industry. That is where a small energy producing town has that as the one sole industry in that town where everybody works. So everybody works at this coal mine. That's the only reason that they live there. They can't afford to pick up and move. And so we need to provide them a just transition to job guarantees somewhere else and support that, because otherwise they're literally going to starve and die. But animal agriculture doesn't have that same problem because of the thing that they told you that David literally explains on my behalf, which is that agriculture towns and agriculture producers have very transferable skills across to non-animal products. So it's very easy for them to use their land to start raising soy. It's very easy for them to use their packing center or their abattoir to start packaging tofu instead of packaging beef. And so it's really fine. They're going to be okay. So we don't need to spend billions of dollars on them. The next thing to say here is about companies, right? They said, look, we'll get more companies. We'll be able to get more change from companies on the supply and the demand end. So they say, look, firstly, they're presuming that the messaging that they provide on their side of the house doesn't come at any cost, right? They're presuming that everybody is still equally energized against the animal agriculture industry in a world where we are tiptoeing around them and trying to make them feel incredibly safe, which I'm going to prove later. It's quite an illogical way of thinking it, but let's just pretend like it's true. The better version of their argument is where they explain that if we make it really easy for labor to shift industries, then we can cripple these companies that are currently the evil ones who are giving us the ads and making us eat all the steaks, right? So the first thing to say there is that it's already incredibly easy to shift jobs out of these industries. It's not necessary to provide a jobs guarantee for the reason we tell you, which is that it's extremely profitable to be a disruptor in the agriculture sector right now. To come up with a vegan alternative to beeswax is an extremely profitable business to enter into. You can afford to pay better wages than the people that are making the unprofitable animal-based products, right? Vegan demand for non-gelatin-based products is far outpacing the ability of people to supply. So you already have a much better paying job for people in that industry. The third and final thing to say here is about politicians want the least expensive way to appease voters, right? So you have to ask them to end an industry that people don't want to end And you have to ask them to like pay all the people's taxes in order to do it, which brings me to the last group of voters, right? Because they say that this messaging is going to portray the movement better because we can avoid getting a critical mass of people who become dissatisfied by the movement in 5 years when they realize that they're unemployed and they also can't get any welfare because the government is so broke because it stops like getting GST from the animal products or something. I wasn't quite sure how that argument worked, but let's take it at their best, right? The reasons why states and politicians, but all the things I say about people being unemployed and being upset are things that states already have natural incentives to avoid. They already have incentives to win swing seats. It's got nothing to do with the messaging of the environmental movement. They have incentives to make sure that people aren't angry at them. So the government is going to pass policies in a very rational way. The job of the environmental movement is not to be a pragmatic politician who tries to save voters. They're going to be very bad at that, right? Their job is to give the goal, to give the imperative that we must try to be more environmentally friendly. Then we let the AOCs of the world or the local members that are distilling our message as a politician make it more palatable to voters by providing them things like not fully job guarantees and a fully just transition, but they soften the rough edges, right? They sand it out. So then the final push they have on this idea of being more convincing, literally the last thing standing, is the idea that we want to try to disable our opponents from being able to argue like, where will all the people go who lose their jobs if we agree with the environmentalist movement and we upset the animal agriculture industry? Which response do you think is better? A, hey, they will get new jobs. It's a very natural process and we don't even need to encourage it. It's free and it's quite logical and we can explain that. Or B, hey, let's spend $200 billion on a jobs guarantee for every single person in the animal agriculture industry. That is a far better argument for your opposition. And that is assuming that society is okay with just killing off the animal product industry, which they never will be. So this is a whole big waste of time that was never going to work. Leading me to the final argument of my speech about why the way that the movement is not actually elitist and that the best thing is what we can do on our side of the debate. Firstly, the movement already has a broad tent with heaps of ideas to choose between. Secondly, left-wing movements already very much value intersectionality. And thirdly, movements already want to be effective and are already trying to defeat arguments against them wherever it is feasible to do so, right? So if it is feasible to reduce the harm caused by becoming more vegan and stuff like that, they already do that because people have a natural incentive within the environmentalist movement to get people on side and get people to agree with them. So they try to do things like say, hey, did you know that you can support local businesses who produce beeswax wraps or whatever? And that means that they can sort of encourage this environmentalist narrative in a way that gets more people on side. And the important thing to say here is that a lot of farmers already support the environmentalist movement, but they won't at the point at which we start suggesting that the industry should die, right? They support it because erosion is their worst enemy. They can't grow some crops when we have climate change and their long-term profits are at risk. So they're already on team us. But when we shift the narrative to end animal products, which isn't even the best way to save the environment, we lose some of our biggest supporters and we heaten the debate against us. And finally, in this argument, it's incredibly bad to center justice at the center of our rhetoric and say that every action that we do should be socially just to everybody, because that's going to freeze us. It makes us a high maintenance girlfriend who's asking for things that are just too hard, which is incredibly unappealing to voters and to politicians, which makes a lot of us start arguing with each other in the movement. We no longer agree with each other and we're coming up with a plan to try to fix an unfixable problem, which is to not piss anybody off. You have to piss somebody off, like we're going to upset Ateneo by making them lose this debate. It's unfortunately just the way that the world works.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the third affirmative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of the affirmatives case.
Here's the microphone. Hello, am I audible? All right. So again, I'm just gonna use your phone, Quintin.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I actually don't think Side Negative has a good grasp of what they're defending in this debate. They say at DLO that it's so easy to shift. We are practically already doing this right now, but that at the same time, it's also so hard to do as the movement that they would absolutely collapse upon the suggestion of this. We were very clear about why it's important that we shift our messaging as the environmental movement. The first is that this information is not readily available in the public, and it's unclear how how they've ever contested this from side negative. And the second thing is, this only becomes easier to transition on our side because we give promise to the people of a tangible and cohesive plan that we shift investment from people, that we get them jobs, and we replace the jobs that they would have had in the animal agricultural industry to other places like the like synthetic meat industry or the plant industry, etc., etc. This key contradiction absolutely destroys their strategy. It either means, number one, they concede our policy is wholly feasible and indeed has very little cost, or number two, that our policy is actually an important thing to do and kills the world because it is so unclear what they would rather have and what are the already good things that the environmental movement is already good at. Op may accuse us of being a high-maintenance girlfriend, but we also ask them, is it really high maintenance to ask your boyfriend to not shoot your dog? Obviously, that speaks for itself. There are two things that I want to address in this whip speech to succinctly win the side for affirmative. The first is, does this resonate with the cohesiveness of the environmental movement's messaging, addressing a lot of the key accusations from side negative? And secondly, in terms of this change, whether or not we actually get this on either side. First, does this resonate with the cohesiveness of the messaging? So the first thing I want to identify is their proposal is to kind of just lazily say that we would focus on what the environmental movement is already good at, like CO2 reduction, climate change, carbon tax, etc., right? But additionally, they don't even explain why the movement is already good at these things, right? I think there's still so much stigma about these things because of the accusation that we talked about from laborers, that it's detached from reality. There are no alternatives. Countries oftentimes choose not to adhere to these regulations because they try to excuse themselves by saying there is no clear plan as to what they would have to do with the displaced laborers, right? I think that if it's already so easy, even if we were to believe the arguments from them that it's so easy that the environmental movement is already good at these things, it's unclear why they wouldn't be equally good at this type of messaging, insofar as the barrier to entry is just convincing people that we aren't taking their jobs, which we are clearly doing, right? The second thing is, I also think this is just a weird policy to have from the very beginning, right? Because they seem to say that we will talk about these things so people don't focus on the animal agricultural industry. But the problem is they didn't challenge from the beginning that, and given that the default is that you already talk about animal issues in status quo, which they had to defend for the reason that, firstly, how they characterize the motivations of the environmental movement seem to be adjacent to this. Secondly, it's actually impossible to solve climate change if we don't talk about the animal agricultural industry, insofar as it makes up a massive percentage of the reason why climate change is accelerating because of the huge carbon emissions that it produces. And thirdly, they are still asked to impose regulations, and presumably these regulations like carbon taxes would still be imposed on the agricultural industry, the animal agricultural industry, because it is such a large force in the movement to begin with. So you cannot just turn and push away from this. Obviously, when people ask, what do we do about these industries, you need to have an answer, and it is only side affirmative that has a concrete way of solving the people's problems, right? To not talk about this as the movement and retain status quo is absolutely terrible even, right? So even if we were to address the way that they want to go about this debate and just not talk about this is the worst possible stance they could have taken, right? I think oftentimes in status quo, they have to acknowledge that often use shame tactics that don't actually make an attempt to relate to the people, that you are a murderer, this cow has a family, etc., which ultimately makes it just people far more averse to these messagings because you paint out meat eaters to be wholly antagonistic, when we on our side give you far more positive incentives for you to opt into this movement, like for example wanting to avoid diseases, like for example wanting to avoid a lot of the ramifications of working in this industry, which they have yet to respond to even then, right? I think that even then, to effectively talk about this is contingent on our plan coming from side affirmative. When people talk about how you're going to tax the animal industry, when you're going to reduce the operation of displaced workers due to the tax for carbon emissions. So even if the priority of this debate are the larger overarching issues like CO2, climate change, etc., these are only things that you can do if you have our discussion from side affirmative, because they seem to virtually have none on side negative, right? And that's why we're really winning the debate, because we choose a more holistic way of forwarding what the movement wants, insofar as we have this, and insofar as by talking about the animal industry, we do things that deal with like climate change, the carbon emissions, but also talk about the animal rights that a lot of people in the movements do adhere to and do feel strongly about, which is also why we have strong solidarity and cohesiveness within the movement, because we are palatable to a lot of the people who are part of this, regardless of what type of like what part of the environmental movement they want to adhere to or what sector that they feel strongly and passionate about, right? And that's why we have critical mass, but it is also because we are far more inclusive of the vast majority of people who aren't even part of the movement, because we promise them that we aren't just trying to take away your jobs. We promise them that we aren't just trying to forward our needs and desires without consulting them, and we actually get more people to be compelled to join, right? I also want to flag that even if neither side is able to get any type of environmental reform, it is the fact that the process of our messaging is far more humane and far more holistic. It is the fact that we as the environmental movement aren't just asserting the desires and the needs of people on the ground, but our process necessarily consults farmers, necessarily consults people within this industry, which is why on face value, the environmental movement just seems to be a lot better, a lot more palatable, to the extent that future policies we may want to pass and future things have far more critical mass and far more people who want to buy in, because right now we seem to be a lot more charitable and we seem to be a lot more inclusive. On all fronts, the movement is essentially better. Second issue then, in terms of change. So their largest accusation to our side is, well, your policy is so expensive. Both sides have a, price and a cost. Both sides are pretty expensive, right? But there is a key distinction between side affirmative and side negative. On side affirmative, we are creating jobs, and there are very simple reasons why, right? Because of the positive change, we would rather have people shift and their skills are transferable. We would rather put them in the plant industry, which is far more efficient because we can maximize the amount of space that we have. And we are transitioning people to make it so that the state does not have to account for welfare, for unemployment, etc., which means that it is sustainable in the long run because the state can actually focus on passing environmental policies because they're not worried about the people who are currently unemployed now. On side negative, where they are just for imposing these regulations like CO2 emissions, carbon emissions, tax, etc., the people need somewhere to go. They just have yet to answer where they expect these people to go. Obviously, even at their best case that they pass these types of things, the government still has to shoulder their unemployment, their welfare, etc., which means that the future environmental action you would have taken is probably non-existent because you don't create a sustainable pathway to being able to better policies for the environment at the end of the day, right? And that is really why, even if both sides have a cost, our cost makes it so that we can afford future costs because we still allow people jobs in the future compared to their side, which simply says, no, you cannot do that, and gives people virtually no alternative. Right? We were also extremely preemptive already from up insofar as even if negative talks about taxing corporations, etc., the point is that there's more unemployment, people become poor, and states are just put in a landlock where they might even have to backslide into environmentally worse off establishments and industries because they want to support people, because of the fact they have no alternatives on the side of negative, and that's why people are far worse off. On all fronts, we take the debate by a huge margin, and that's why we are proud to affirm. Thanks. No.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And to conclude the substantive portion of this debate, I'd like to welcome the third negative speaker.
Cool. Sorry, can I be heard now? The position of side negative was very clear. The environmentalist movement had a very limited budget. It had a limited amount of airtime it could ever get on media because there was only so much the media was ever going to care about the environment. That was fixed. And that they had a limited capacity to influence people because people had limited bandwidth to deal with environmental narratives and environmental messaging, which meant that they would only ever remember one or two things the environmental movement said. You couldn't just have a stance on everything and mention those stances all the time. You had to pick what you focused, you had to pick what you prioritized on. And we said that this was the wrong message to focus on, and it was the wrong message to prioritize. because it was deeply effective, because you had very little credibility on it, and because it was an issue that was already being addressed by private actors, which meant that we ought to act on the places where we're credible, where we could make the most marginal change, and importantly, where we're the only people who could make those particular stances. We told you that on our side, we would still use the tools of the environmentalist movement. We would just argue for other things, like carbon taxes, like greater renewable energy investment, or the conservation of individual places, like, for example, the Great Barrier Reef or other important parts of nature that other people would not be advocating for, which is exactly why the first reason why side Affirmative must lose, because they've never actually weighed the efficacy of their policy against that of the very credible alternatives. They always just suggest, well, like it's necessary to engage in this policy as well, or, you know, this is just a good idea, we should do it. We point to the fact that the environmentalist movement would just be far more successful doing these other things, which is the first reason we should win the debate. The second thing I want to do in this speech, though, is examine the internal effects on the movement, because this is the fastest way that side negative is able to win the debate. We tell you a number of things that receive insufficient response. Firstly, we point out, importantly, that many of the people within this movement, since the environmentalist movement is a very broad coalition of people who care about different aspects in the environment, care about the environment for different reasons, many people within the movement are animal rights activists, and that they will see this policy as an unacceptable series of concessions, because it involves a huge amount of empathy for the people who they perceive as committing a genocide against animals, very little concern for those animals, very little concern for their moral considerations on this particular issue. We get one response to this argument, which is that the environmentalist movement is obviously very empathetic and pro-humanity, which is why they would not care. We point out that we're not talking about the movement writ large, we're talking about specific members of the movement, i.e. people who are animal rights activists, whose core part of their identity is caring about animals, and notably, who are very empathetic, which is why they view this policy as condoning genocide of animals, which is something that they hold as deeply personal, which is why they would never countenance this, which is why they would leave the movement. Secondly, we explained to you that a key problem with this narrative is that as soon as you center conceptions of justice in your narratives, you give easy ammunition to anyone with a pet grievance within the movement to argue that the policy is imperfect because it doesn't count for justice for this minority group or that minority group. Or what about people in Bolivia? Or what about like people who engage in meat for traditional medicine or so on? You give so many easy narratives to explain why the concept of justice doesn't work. You grind the movement to a halt. The environmentalist movement couldn't engage in every possible left-wing cause. It picked the environment, need to be efficacious on the issue of the environment. Thirdly, we address the issue of opportunity cost, which suggests that various people within the environmental movement, very committed to other types of messaging, very few are likely to care particularly about the workers in the meat industry, which means that everyone gets upset when they feel like their airtime that could have been spent arguing for conservation or a carbon tax or anything that they deeply care about is being wasted on this policy that is all about why like ranchers in Texas deserve better jobs or something, which is why they would never get on board. They have one sort of response to this argument writ large, which is just to say, well, we help the movement attract workers, which is really important for the movement. We give you several responses. Firstly, we suggest the environmentalist movement is probably already a very broad tent and probably already includes a very large set of people. We note, for example, that it often cobbles together coalitions of various different groups, like often indigenous groups are a key part of the environmental movement in some countries like Bolivia. In other contexts, often animal rights activists might be a key part of the movement. They don't give us any structural reasoning as to why it is probably deficient in outreach to those particular groups. And we suggest that there are strong reasons why it would want to talk to all kinds of different people, i.e. it wants to be effective, it wants its messages to resonate with a large number of people. It's probably not just like a bunch of like really rich left-wing people being like, I wonder what the poor people like, and then just throwing ads out willy-nilly. But additionally, we suggest there are strong reasons why working class people would already buy into the movement. For example, the fact that they're often the biggest victims of environmental injustice, like air pollution primarily affects people who live in the bad parts of town, who are workers, who probably would want to buy into a movement that would do its utmost in order to improve those kinds of things. Poor people can also have moral considerations around climate change to reasons that they probably already do buy in. What was the implication at the end of this argument? We explained to you that in the worst case for side affirmative, this could be sufficient to fracture the movement. It could cause the various groups to splinter over the fact that there were opportunity cost issues, over the fact that they couldn't countenance the idea of supporting these branches, which was why the movement was unable to do any form of activism. So it not only defeated the capacity of AF to achieve its messaging, which they were contingent on for winning the debate, but also any of the other messaging that the movement does, or any of the other activism that the movement does. But in the far more generous worst case beside affirmative, we suggest that even if this only makes the movement somewhat less effective, which is a relatively charitable conception of what might occur, that just raises the burden on side affirmative to demonstrate that their messaging is so much more effective than any alternate messaging you could do in achieving environmental impacts, because they would need to do so with a movement that was less capable of making that messaging, that received less donations, that people put a bit less time into. Let's then examine the question of messaging and see if they meet that latter burden. Noting that I've already pointed out their failure to weigh against the various things we do, let's explain why this messaging will get zero traction at all, though, winning us the debate for the third time. We point out, and this is really very strange that they haven't yet responded to it, is that if you want to end the practice of animal agriculture, the key group you need to persuade is consumers. That's for a very simple reason, that the industry does not brainwash people into eating meat. The industry exists because consumers want meat and meat products and animal products. And as long as people want it, the industry will continue to provide it. And it doesn't matter how convinced the industry is that they could invest in other things, or how convinced the workers are that better jobs await. So long as incentives exist and consumers want these products, they will continue to produce them, which means that unless this messaging could convince consumers to change their behavior, it had literally zero efficacy at all. We give you a set of reasons as to why consumers would not change their mind. One, that they really like these products. They love the taste of them, and that's why they buy them. Two, that there's huge prestige in the consumption of meat, particularly in developing countries. Three, that there are cultural connections to traditional medicine, to things like holidays, to things like rituals. Fourthly, that this requires a truly phenomenal shift in consumer behavior, because this is most foods. It's not just meat, it's animal products. It's things like leather, it's things like silk, it's things like gelatin that we talk about. And because you have no credibility when talking to these consumers, which meant that if you could not address the behavior of consumers, there was no way, no matter how much you persuaded voters or politicians or industry, anything changes, because none of those groups would act in the absence of consumers. Politicians wouldn't ban or regulate an industry if consumers, who are the majority of voters, obviously, didn't want them to. By contrast, though, on our side, if we just change consumer behavior, there's no need to convince any of those groups, because the industry just shrinks on its own. The people naturally move to other areas. And we explained that we're able to do that just by pointing to private investment in things like lab-grown meat and plant-based alternatives. Second negative gives you a whole range of examples of messaging you could talk about that might persuade consumers about how they can make more ethical choices, that may appeal to their good side and makes them feel virtuous for acting in positive ways, instead of making them feel like they're doing something bad. Their final Hail Mary argument is just to say the perception of the movement is bad. We need something to say when they ask, where are people going to get jobs? We point out First Off concedes that these people have transferable skills and could easily do other things like plant soy instead of ranching. So it's unclear why people don't already know that and why we couldn't use those arguments. But additionally, no one would believe your arguments that the jobs guarantee exists, because it's pie in the sky that would cost hundreds of billions, and conservative audiences weren't here to listen to it. Incredibly proud to negate.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the negative reply speaker to conclude the negative team's case.
Hey, can I be heard? Cool, just 1 sec, sorry. You're muted, just in case. Shoot. So sorry. That is entirely my bad. I'll start again. Oh, good. So, right, start in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to begin this speech by asking the question, is a just transition in this industry even a feasible political idea? And I'm beginning here because it's the most charitable place for me to begin for the affirmative team. So let's assume, but not concede, that this messaging choice wouldn't damage the internal movement, wouldn't damage the movement internally a tremendous amount, as we show. Let's also assume, but not concede, this will in some margin be persuasive for some people. Here is where the material from second negative is debate-winning, because it explains why it's often fine for workers to change jobs, why energy and agriculture are key different sectors with different structures, why agricultural workers have other products that they can sell, and the transition away from meat would create jobs for them to move to, and that meat workers can also move to other jobs. And it's curious because AF repeatedly assert, oh, what would happen to these workers? How can you just leave them behind? But their answer as to what would be the politically winning message for the movement to embrace, given that this industry is changing, is to promise a tremendous spending program, as if this wouldn't be a tool that conservatives would use far more effectively than just pressing us on workers, as if this wouldn't be a tool that would be actually persuasive to taxpayers, who of course structurally form a majority of not only people, but also meat consumers, whereas meat workers are already in a minority. Let's examine then whether, even if we wanted this policy to occur, whether it would be something the environmental movement could persuade people. And it is here that side affirmative also suffer from a lack of responsiveness, because side negative show the consumers have strong preferences to eat meat, and the only change in their preferences is compelling stories about how animals, about how it might harm the environment or animals might be hurt, not compelling stories about how you could protect workers. They then explain that people in the industry are fearful of losing jobs and, have direct interests that are contrary to this messaging, so I'd like to believe you. And they finally explain that politicians are reluctant to make large promises, like, for example, the promise of a just transition. It seems quite unclear why this messaging choice by the environmental movement would, on the margin, persuade anyone, because the environmental movement is not seen as necessarily a particularly credible actor engaging in this sort of jobs and growth messaging. But, and more importantly, it is also just not an idea that really works or gains for a few people. Maybe it gains a few, but let's examine the idea here a little more critically, because the marginal gain is what side of affirmative have to defend. And they see the idea that the environmental movement is not the critical actor, because there already exists a tremendous amount of private and public capital that are behind creating lab-grown meat and satisfying people's preferences for this particular product. If you believe that context, if you believe to that, which they have no response to, if you believe that there already is a way in which meat will become something that can become lab-grown, there are other alternatives that are incentives to create, then the marginal difference they create in shifting people's preferences here is nil, and they have to lose the round. But let's examine AF's case further critically again, because side negative have an alternate win path in this debate that they never sufficiently respond to. Side negative explain that it is quite likely this will damage the internals of the movement, because when the movement is no longer focused on a small set of things and has to expand that focus, it prompts infighting from different members who often have different goals and want their things to be prioritized. Side affirmative really rely on a simple kind of response where they say, oh, well, the environmental movement selects for people who are empathetic, but side negative has two winning responses. The first is that is obviously not the case for animal rights allies in the movement who are not empathetic in this circumstance. And secondly, that empathy is not limitless, especially when side negative explains to no response that there is an opportunity cost of marketing, that members engage the most with this marketing, they care about it the most. This is their donations often at work. They care very much about this particular material. The final last gasp they say is, oh, well, the workers we include might expand the movement, but side negative deal with this incredibly easily. One, they point out this guarantees the animal rights movement's leave. Two, there aren't very many meat workers. Three, if there are workers, they're going to have other reasons to buy in. And four, meat workers hear the word transition, think you're coming for their jobs, and don't help you. This is never a message the environmental movement should have engaged in. It came at the cost of other priorities and our ability to talk to. Even if we wanted to talk about it, we weren't very credible and probably didn't want it in the first place.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech, and thanks to NEG as a whole. And now I'd like to welcome the affirmative reply speaker to conclude the debate.
Hello, can I be heard? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Much like the environmentalist movement on op bench, op strategy is to avoid all the most important issues because they're losing them. The first thing I'm going to show is the comparative, because they really talk up their comparative about how whatever they do is more impactful and easier without picking one, and also without explaining why it actually is more impactful. Let's break this down. The first thing we do that should be debate winning right away is that the ground we set the debate on is the mental bandwidth is already to some degree being spent on the strategy of animal agriculture. We give you a variety of proofs for this. The first is that it's empirical. They're already attempting to discuss animal agriculture, and so at some point they have to come up with a solution for it. Number two, their point on op that some members are extremely motivated to protect animals is another reason for why this might be the case. The third thing is, again, the proof from op that a variety of tech and social factors are pushing towards animal agriculture being the forefront of something. And just the fourth thing that this on its own is incredibly impactful in terms of actual carbon emissions and the percentage of that relative to other industries. So we said, the majority of this debate was already on this mental bandwidth. And so their side on opposition saying it's impossible to solve this doesn't respond to the material from government that it is easier to solve this when you have the strategy, because if it is expensive, it is cheaper to give workers jobs and to give them an alternative. Their response on opposition that it is expensive to guarantee jobs gets absolutely yeeted out of the water, one by their DLO's own responses, which is to say a variety of tech factors are making it cheaper, which means all we have to do is highlight these tech factors and make investment more palatable. And number two is that we showed it was more expensive to not do anything, because if some workers were indeed unemployed, then they would make things harder for the environmental improvement and they would make it more expensive for the state. So if all their stuff is that it is more expensive, this is really a them problem, because we show it gets gradually cheaper, and all of their responses to the top level of material doesn't respond to the way they actually interact, which is that the way of the things we propose make things better. Beyond that, secondly, look at even their alternatives. They say a carbon tax is easy, which is one of the wild assertions I've ever heard. Beyond that, they have to go again in opposition to their previous statements that the movement had in the past if they really want to drop the animal movement. And even then, they don't even explain why their policies would be good. What Quintin shows to you to no response is that even if you do everything else successfully, if you just fail at successfully advocating for an animal agriculture transition, you still kill the world. Which is why we illustrate that this on impactfulness is much more important than the carbon tax and much more feasible to do. So that is the first point, and it shows in the 90% of cases where you do believe that this is the battleground of the debate, and you should, because they don't def challenge, they don't provide any reason for why they do alternatives, and skip out on this one wholly means we're winning. But let's say in the 10% of debates where you do believe there's a comparative, and this comparative is some alternative thing, they never prove why it's any less divisive or why it's any less toxic. I guess people like meat, they also need gasoline to live, right? And what we showed to you is that many of the intersectional concerns are to a much greater degree, because the analysis from Quintin is murderous to their case, because it shows maybe people are aggrieved over meat. Not only do we provide an alternative, that there's cultivated lab-grown meat, that there are greener agricultural alternatives, such that even if you still do meat, the meat that you do is much cleaner because it relies less on releasing CO2 in the atmosphere. Even if you don't believe that, the comparison of asking someone to drop their job, to drop going on all airfare, to drop any plastic products, and to massively pay for much more rent, it's just much more divisive to their movement. Like, they say, well, the movement's already diverse and inclusive, which is a response against their side. But what we show specifically is that it lacks diversity in the particular direction of workers, which is why we also aim to fix it, because we agree that the environmental movement can do some bad. Op doesn't guarantee that their alternative policies they advocate for would even be good in the first place, because it lacks sufficient diversity from workers on the ground, whom apparently Op hates, which is why we would attempt to bridge bridges in the first place to be able to get their movements in the first place. So if Op is suggesting they do alternative policies, they never suggest a good reason for why these alternative policies would be good given the lack of sufficient diversity on opposition. The final thing I want to dunk on is their point on zero efficacy, which we absolutely destroy, because not only do the two things I say about having cultivated lab-grown meat and having greener meat alternatives better, like, we also showed you some pretty incisive economic analysis that this is in part artificially stimulated by artificial demand created by companies, and we would create a massive change even if we only fix that part, whereas Op still has all the same consumer demand problems with cars, with carbon, and so on, and they fix none of that. That's why Affirmative wins this debate and advances to the semifinals.
Okay, thanks very much for that reply, and thanks to all speakers for a fantastic debate.